Morning everybody, and welcome to our Construction Forum Christmas special. Obviously had to have the obligatory Christmas background. It is the 10th of December, well and truly into it now. So I think this time of year always triggers a bit of contemplation and looking back, and it made me think about our first ever construction forum, which was actually in May 2023 when I looked back. I can't actually believe how quickly the time has passed since then. So this is our 7th quarterly construction forum session, and I have to say we've been thrilled by the number of people who've engaged with and joined us in these sessions. So after today, our next session will be in March 2025, which feels currently like a very long way away, but I'm sure will come round more quickly than any of us could have imagined. I just at this point wanted to slightly embarrass Helen Batter, who's on the call. She is heavily involved in the background with this and lots of other things for SP, but she is due to go on mat leave imminently, and so she won't be on our next forum in March, but we will look forward to welcoming her back in due course.
I'm not sure she'll stay away, actually.
I'm sure she'll message me in the background. I'll be honest with you guys. Obviously, as I said, March is a little way away, and so you do have plenty of time. If you have got any suggestions of what you'd like us to cover in that session, please do get in touch with us. We always like to hear from you. So turning to today's session, on securing the future of council housing. This is, of course, a massive topic, and I'm delighted to introduce our panel who are going to seek to address some of the questions and issues relating to this particular topic. So we have Steve Partridge, who's Director and Head of Housing Consultancy at Savills. We have my SP colleagues, Justin Mendel, Senior Partner and Head of Construction, Joe Pickering, Partner and Head of Real Estate, and Helen Batter, Managing Associate in the construction team. So as many of you will know, the London Borough of Southwark commissioned the report titled Securing the Future of Council Housing. The report canvassed 20 of the country's largest council landlords and also sought input from bodies such as the Local Government Association, the Association of Retained Council Housing, London Councils and the National Housing Federation. And analysis and advice was provided by none other than Steve Partridge, who joins us today. And so without further ado, I'll pass to him to provide some insights into that report. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. And thanks to Sharp Pritchard for extending the invitation to me this morning. Very pleased to help you out with a introduction to the discussion around the finances of councils. So Melissa, you're gonna do my Chris Whitty style driving, yeah? And you've already moved on from the title, but I was just wanting to say, by way of introduction, this is about the financial background for councils and council housing, as well as the background to the Southwark report. I'm going to take you through a little bit more of a background in terms of what those financial pressures are, particularly drawing upon work that we did, research that we did for the Local Government Association, which was used quite liberally within the Southwark report, and draw together the key kind of financial strands. Now, I'm going to bring it as up to date as we can by reflecting also upon the rent consultation that is currently out and is kind of due for response by the 23rd of December following the budget at the end of October, which might give, well, we shall see, and we can discuss it as we go through the session. Might give a little bit of relief from some of the pressures and some of the issues and some of the challenges that the report brings out. So very briefly, I'm going to flip through this, give a bit of background on each slide around the challenges and pressures, and then hopefully in around about 15 minutes time I'll hand over to the other panel members and they can pick up some of the other issues around this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the backdrop for the HRA housing revenue account. For those that hang on a second, Melissa, if that's okay. We're going to introduce the financial pressures affecting council housing, a little bit about the research into expenditure pressures, which we've updated this year, a little bit around that policy consultation and whether that might look like a different future, and then summarise the Southwark report at the end. Okay, Melissa, sorry. So you need to press three times here. So the housing revenue account for stock holding local authorities, for those authorities that hold more than 200 homes. Around half of English local authorities continue to have council housing. The brown ones on the map there transferred their housing over the last 20-25 years to housing associations through a programme of large-scale voluntary transfer. The housing revenue account is ring-fenced. Basically, it means that income has to balance, expenditure has to balance with income, and that's really important in the HRA context at the minute, because as we will see, and as the Southwark report has identified, expenditure currently outstrips income for the HRA. Now, for almost a century, we had a national council housing programme, but since 2012, we've been self-financing, and since 2018, we've been properly self-financing without a cap on debt. So we have all the tools needed to invest in stock, services and new supply. And in theory, we have all the flexibility a local authority needs. But what we know in practice is the net income that local authorities are able to generate significantly impacts on their ability to do what they need and want to do in terms of new supply, temporary accommodation, or investment in the existing stock. So what the Southwark report is not asking for is a fundamental change to the legislative backdrop of the HRA, but it is asking for financial changes and financial resources to be made available in a range of different ways. Okay, Melissa. So we've got 4 clicks on here. So this is around the economic pressures for that everybody is familiar with. We've seen generational inflation in the top left. And even though the CPI measure has come down over the last year or so, as we know, and headline inflation is now around 1.7 to 2.5%, there is bags of evidence that pressures within council housing finance, particularly on the expenditure side, remain well above CPI and even well above BCIS indices for maintenance costs. Bank of England base rates have taken off massively since the early part of 2022. And that kind of forecast of coming down in the bottom left-hand corner there continues to sort of stretch into the future. And every time we get another Bank of England forecast, the rate at which it reduces down to 3% seems to stretch into the future. Top right there is yesterday's 30-year gilt. That drives the borrowing costs for local authorities. If you click again, Melissa, you can see the impact on PWLB rates there, over 5.5% for 50-year borrowing. Less than 2 years ago, the equivalent amount was less than 2%. So we've added 3.5%, nearly 4% onto the cost of borrowing. You can see that reflected in the gilt rate there, starting in January 2022, and you can see it's up still nearer 5% now. And interestingly, the top right-hand bit of the right-hand chart, you can see we're nearly as high as that spike in September 2022, which was the Truss budget. So we've not really recovered from the downfall of that day, if you like. So moving on then, what does that mean for council housing? Well, even though we've returned to CPI plus 1% increase for rents for 24/5 and 25/6, 7% maximum increase this year and 2.7% only for next year. The yellow numbers there identify where we believe, from our work with local authorities around the country, that inflation rates really are. So pay award, supplier, contractor inflation, supplier material inflation, utilities and construction and capital. So I know that the BCIS all-in maintenance index and the BCIS construction index seem to be saying that we are down now at sort of 2.5%, 3%. The reality is, when we look at business plans and budgets around the country, there is still inflation above those rates. And sometimes we can see inflation up to 15%. Don't forget, we've also had the national insurance costs, which I'm sure affect many of you on the call today if you're in the private sector or in a housing association. National insurance costs may be compensated for local authorities in the main, but there is no word yet as to whether they will be compensated for council housing services. So many are having to make deep cuts or to use reserves in order to prop up services and delivery. Okay, Melissa, we did some work with the Local Government Association, the Association Retained Council Housing and the National Federation of ALMOs a couple of years ago now. and we revisited that. And this research informed the Southwark report, and then we revisited that this year. I'm going to take you through some of those headlines. The reason why the LGA revisited it this year is there's a strong feeling that the dial on expenditure has really moved significantly further in the last 12 to 18 months since this original report from January 2023. So previously our headlines were inflationary pressures are greater than inflation. Fire and building safety costs were 7.7 billion. Where was that coming from? EPCC and net zero was going to be 23 billion with no sense of where that was going to come from. That revenue pressures from professionalisation and the competence and conduct standard would potentially get up to 150 million, and that new build costs and funding pressures increased grant requirements by up to £45,000 per property. So this is 2 years ago that we were identifying these pressures, and the pressures have magnified and intensified since. Okay, so first is capital investment. You're in a construction forum here, you know all about this. Whether it's life cycle replacements, a revision to the Decent Home Standard, what we still need to do on fire and building safety, EPCC by 2030, net zero carbon by 2050. We're now looking at non-net zero, so sort of core investment property, core investment needs over the course of the next 30 years of between £58,000 per property up to £90,000 per property in some parts of London. Now, if you just take a step back, £90,000 a property, that's £3,000 per property per year for capital investment for council housing. We've seen the dial change massively in the last couple of years. These figures were nowhere near these numbers a couple of years ago. Now, that's a combination of inflation, of supply chain pressures, but also setting higher standards. Now, bottom left is our average weighted of 62 grand a unit, those based on our sample of business plan profiles. And I think what we're finding, we're really interested to tease this out in the discussion later, is we're finding that the enhanced regulatory engagement, enhanced consumer standards, the inspections that the regulators now undertaking, and they're saying you need data about the stock, about the service, about your tenants. And we think that that is driving surveyors to price more risk into their survey totals. I work for a firm of surveyors, and we've had this debate internally all the time. But there is also some question here about, is the condition of the stock worse than we thought? Because many properties that are now being surveyed, we haven't been in for 20 or 25 years, and they're finding potentially that there are some additional challenges. Okay, Melissa. So capital investments, we think now 62 grand a unit. The amount that's in the system to fund that is no more than 40 grand a unit. And even if PCIS were applied to the figures that we had in the system, it would be only £48,000 a unit. So under all reasonable and rational measures, we are underfunded on capital investment for the existing stock. And just as an example there, and you will all know this much better than me, kitchen provision in 2012 was priced into the funding of council housing at £3,000 a kitchen. With CPI, that would now be about 4 grand a kitchen. Currently, we're averaging between 5.5 to 8 grand a kitchen. You know, we've seen generational inflation, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. Okay, next. On energy efficiency, we were talking an average of £7,700 a property across the stock to get them to bring up to EPCC. We're now up at 9 grand. And we think the decarbonisation is probably nearer £25 billion now on the basis of around 25 grand per unit across the entire stock. If you're a local authority landlord, one of your key things is to engage with DESNZ around establishing and how we can think about establishing a longer term plan. Okay, Melissa. On revenue repairs, I mean, in some ways, it's even worse and even more pressured. The Awaab's law stuff following Rochdale on damp and mould and condensation. Around 20% of properties are subject to some form of complaint or engagement or contact with local authority landlords in a 2-year period. And we're seeing some significant impact on responsive repairs from surveys, actually. Surveys going into properties that haven't been surveyed for 20 years. They're finding, I don't know, sockets hanging off the wall, or the smoke alarm isn't up to date, or the battery on the carbon monoxide alarm has gone. You know, relatively low level health and safety hazards, but they all need to be dealt with within a certain period of time. We think repairs budgets are 12%. Running at 12% inflation to 24-25, but actual costs may well be higher than those budgets set this year. Okay. A little bit on professionalisation and regulation. So not such big numbers here, but a definite pressure, which is also hitting local authorities. So maybe sort of up to around 50 million on professionalisation and around 30 to 35 million on the regulatory system and enhanced regulation. Okay. So on the face of it, the latest announcements from the government in the budget provide the potential that the government has understood the need for more income and more investment into social housing, and particularly council housing. So the core proposal within the budget, as I'm sure you all know, is to firm up rent increases for 5 years to 2031, and then to add additional options for 5-year settlements or up to a 7 or a 10-year settlement. And this is one of the key things that the Southwark report and other trade and professional bodies have been asking for. There's a core proposal to allow increases to go CPI +1 up to 10 years. And of course, that's again one of the absolute key and critical asks of the social housing world, of the new government as it came in earlier on in the year. And there are other questions in the consultation around additional funding options for social housing providers, but it doesn't provide for convergence back to formula rents or reopening the whole basis of setting social rents and the social rent formula in the first place. Well, of course, we do have the ability to respond and say that that should be, but it is not envisaged within the budget. And of course, all of this is in the context of what additional capacity for investment a stable rent policy might be able to deliver. The absolute key here, and this is really kind of live and kicking as we speak, whether it's Southwark, whether it's the LGA, whether it's the National Housing Federation, is the extent to which CPI +1 rent increases are, you know, the government is looking at that as how many more properties towards the 1.5 million target will that enable us to build. But actually, most of the sector from where we're sitting are responding by saying CPI +1 is actually just a minimum of what we need in order to keep going, to be honest. On the other plus side, however, we do have the right to buy risk. Okay, Melissa, just quickly on the right to buy, restrictions on maximum discounts and eligibility. Pretty much everything we've asked for there is in the consultation on the right to buy. Okay, Melissa, sorry. So just as an indication of just how important rent policy is, so this is two projections to inform the current consultation responses for the trade bodies. So the top right there is the forecast of the in-year surpluses and deficits if we only had CPI increases in rents for the next 10 years and into the future. And you can see, you're not misreading that. It dives into deficit in the next 5 years as we meet EPCC and fire and building safety, and then it continues to go in deficit thereafter. Now, bottom right is CPI +1 for 10 years with convergence, and you can see how that recovers the position after 5 years back to an in-year surplus. It doesn't address the in-year deficits and the pressures in the very short to medium term, the very immediate to short term, if I might say. So the key takeaways from this is we need CPI +1 just to survive even before thinking about new build. But not even CPI +1 and convergence addresses the very short-term pressures and the need for an immediate cash injection. So if we go on to the next slide, then there's not enough money in the system. And this is the absolute key and underpinning principle of the Southwark report, is that there needs to be a complete refresh of the framework. If the nation wants good quality, sustainable council housing, we need to find more money and invest more money from somewhere. So whether we've changed on rents, on higher standards after Grenfell and Rochdale, on inflation, generational inflation, on demand for repairs, on new regulatory burdens, on higher interest rates or higher development costs, there are pressures in all directions and we need more money. In reality, and all of these guys on the next slide are pushing for their cut of the cake, if you like. Hello? Oh yeah, all of these guys are pushing for their cut of the cake. So the NatFed's capacity analysis on the top left there. We've done some work with the CIH on reopening the debt settlement and reducing debt and writing off debt within local authorities. And then obviously we have the Southwark report. So if we go on to the next slide, Melissa, there's only 4 areas that we can get more money into the system. We can either allow rents to go higher to create more income. We can give more grants. We can find income from new places, particularly people thinking around net zero, but of course that's underdeveloped at the minute, or we can write off debt. In practice, we probably need to move forward on all 4 of these, but apart from rents for the next 5 years, we can't assume any of them will actually happen. So if we go on to the last slide then, just to bring this together, hopefully it's been a bit of a sweep through the main pressures, but hopefully we've got the main points out. Where the Southwark report draws on all of this evidence base is to come up with 5 solutions to secure the future of council housing. And as Rachel said, initially led by the top 20 landlords and eventually signed by 100 authority leaders. So the fair and sustainable HRA model is the point that I've been making all the way through. It's not just one thing. We need to move forward on all of these fronts. So it's not just income, not just expenditure, not just debt. It's all the components of a sustainable framework. On the right to buy, broadly, the government has responded positively to the work within the report. Red tape on the Affordable Homes Programme and other funds. Well, of course, we've seen the Local Authority Housing Fund become very popular, very flexible, very positive. People responded positively to that. Homes England will be changed, of course, as we know, with a new chief executive and a new Affordable Homes Programme from 2026. We do need to find a long-term solution for net zero, of course we do, and whether that's cost of the public purse or bringing in private finance. And then finally, give councils the capacity, both financial and resource capacity, to bring forward stalled and challenged sites in order to hit towards the 1.5 million. One of the key things here is that we need more money for the existing council housing to survive. And in order for us to think about new build and providing a meaningful contribution towards that 1.5 million target that the new government has, we need to settle the knitting, if you like, and the basics before we can start to turn our focus outwards. And that's the feeling I get from most local authorities, including Southwark, is their big ambitions for a programme of new build. They've stalled back on that because they have to focus on the existing stock from regulatory pressures and financial pressures. And we need a sea change back now in order to release local authority capacity for investment in new build once we've sorted the existing stock. Okay, I think I took 21 minutes, Rachel, so my apologies for going over by a minute, but hopefully that has given a nice background for other people to just pick up on some of the key things.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. And I won't hold the 1 minute against you, but I will be marshalling the responses to the panel questions like a BBC presenter marshalling an electoral debate. So watch out, panel members. No pressure. So thank you very much, Steve. That was incredibly insightful. So as Steve's mentioned, I'm now going to just address some more specific questions to the SP panel. So I'm going to start with Helen. So the report rightly identifies that everyone should have a home in which they feel comfortable and safe. And of course, as Steve has mentioned, the issue of safety has loomed large since the Grenfell tragedy, which prompted an overhaul of the regulatory regime. The Building Safety Act and the costs associated with fire safety remediation are, of course, referenced in that report. And Steve mentioned there the 7.7 billion figure. Helen, how significant and/or challenging has the Building Safety Act been since its implementation from your perspective?
Thank you, Rachel. I think it's pretty safe to say that implementation of the Building Safety Act has been both hugely significant and challenging for the sector. Whilst I think few would disagree that it's a necessary development, it's undoubtedly slowed construction in the sector in particular. Although the Act received royal assent back in 2022, a lot of its content came into effect through secondary legislation in a phased and somewhat sort of piecemeal fashion. So this presented challenges initially as the industry were having to grapple with something new that was initially something of a movable feast, depending on the stage of the project and its projected timeline. So unsurprisingly, this generated uncertainty and increased costs, and also slowed progress. The breadth of application of the new regime to both non-higher risk and also higher risk buildings means that a majority of projects are caught, and this necessitates an understanding of the applicable requirements to those by those involved. So one of the key developments from the legislation is the emphasis on competency of those carrying out the various roles under the new duty holder regime, under the building regulations. And this has been a challenge for those acting as an employer in particular, as they are now tasked with not only just assessing initial competence, but also monitoring that competency throughout the project life cycle. And there's been a degree of uncertainty as to how to go about doing that, as well as a need to put appropriate resourcing in place to manage that side of things. There's also been a degree of uncertainty for initially around contractors and consultants carrying out those roles, particularly for principal designer, and there's been various discussions around who's best placed to undertake that role for any given project. So this is an area where, whilst there were initially quite a few challenges to overcome, that the position does seem to be settling more and more as we're sort of getting used to the requirements there. Another area is the gateway process, and that's been fairly challenging to navigate on those higher risk buildings. The building safety regulator is experiencing delays in processing the applications it's receiving, and that's obviously slowed progress on those HRB projects. The BSR has recognised it needs to recruit in order to be able to deal with the volume of applications it's receiving in a much more timely manner. And although it's been shown that the quality of applications the quality of applications it's receiving is starting to improve based on recent figures, there is still a recognition that there is a need for guidance on the applications and their content. And although this is something the BSR has not something they feel able to do themselves, they are looking to sort of tap into the guidance and resources that have been put together by organisations such as the Construction Leadership Council, and the idea being that will make the process easier to navigate and give those involved a better understanding of what's required of them. Another really significant and challenging areas in respect of the remediation of unsafe cladding on those existing buildings, with widespread recognition at that sort of higher government level that this is being addressed far too slowly. What work has been done to identify the sort of numbers of affected buildings, and an acceleration plan is being put together with investigation into potential for forcing action by freeholders, reforming construction products industry, the existing industry there, and also holding sort of social landlords to account for those issues. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government has identified in respect of its portfolio that the pace is, as I sort of said, well behind expectations, and so has been required to assess the position and possible ways to address this issue. It's identified that there are still ongoing challenges around capability of fire engineers, as well as contractor capacity and the speed of work. So as it is not currently on course to achieve the remediation of all buildings over 11 metres by 2035, there are still some significant challenges to overcome. And so there's come an acknowledgement of a need to facilitate the resolution of disputes between developers and freeholders in terms of proportionality in particular, and also looking at minimising delays to the building control approvals by the BSR. So this is therefore having knock-on effects on what are already fairly strained resources for the social housing providers, and it also impacts on and is also informing behaviours, as you'd expect in respect of new projects, issues around risk appetite and also insurance. So in summary, the BSA has been and continues to be very significant, and is also still very challenging in terms of its implications for various other aspects of the sector.
Thank you, Helen. I think that's a really comprehensive run through the various trials and tribulations as we've sort of seen with our clients over the past 2 years, really. Thank you. So moving on to my next question, which is for Justin. So a number of the recommendations within the report refer to the need to consider opportunities for collaboration and sharing of best practice between local government authorities, but also between local government and registered providers. Justin, how do you think that collaborative working between councils can be enhanced? And perhaps more importantly, how do they look to secure successful long-term partnerships with suppliers?
Thank you, Rachel. So the age-old question, best cooperation between councils, and then extending that to RPs. So I think there's 3 main points I wanted to cover. The first one I'd say is that cooperation should begin at home, and what I mean by that is within individual authorities, there are quite often disparate approaches within different departments, or portfolio holders have got different views as to how they see things operating, and a joined up coherent approach within individual councils I think is crucial before they can begin to look at how they cooperate with other councils. The second point for me is it's been discussed for as long as I've been doing this, but a less tribal approach as between councils. I can draw on very specific experience where we've had external, what appears to be collaboration between councils, joined up procurements, even some sort of badging that says we're now working together. But the reality is, behind the scenes, things are much more individualized, and you don't get that genuine cooperation. And I think the 2 places that needs to be addressed is at the most senior level. So at chief exec level, we need kind of public declarations of we're in a different place. And I know Steve did extremely well to get through that report in 20 odd minutes, but we can see just the scale of the challenges that are ahead of us. Things need to be done differently, and that is not an easy mindset to change. But I think as between the councils, there needs to be that grown-up recognition, I say, starting at the top, and then that needs to work its way through to the rest of the organisation. As between the councils and RPs themselves, I mean, it's again, if we go back to the map that Steve had up right at the beginning, that tells, I think, a fairly frightening story as to what the relationship is currently between councils and RPs across the country. So I think there is a period of building that can be done in addition to all the construction building, but relationship building that's needed between those various RPs and the relevant councils. I said 3, in fact, it's going to be 4 points. My third point was where I have seen some success is local authorities setting up their own frameworks. So carrying out capital works or R&M frameworks, whatever the case is, having that for themselves, and then other authorities able to access it. Now, that's not strictly a partnership type collaboration, but where one authority is able to act as a trailblazer, for lack of a better term, and it gone to market, secured good providers, that then being opened up to other authorities, that's obviously a very well-worn path, but better cooperation between authorities when setting up the framework, I think could be one important step. And then the fourth one is we're entering into a new procurement landscape. So Procurement Act 2023, not yet enforced, as everyone will know, possibly enforced in the next 3 months, although if rumours are to be believed, maybe not until later in the year, but at some point it's going to come into effect. And the ability to run a competitive flexible procedure, whatever that may look like, I think will give authorities as between themselves, great opportunities for collaboration, but potentially some really interesting collaborations between local authorities and RPs, and the sorts of procurements that we haven't actually seen before. And again, for those who are brave and prepared to try something new and different, that could be something that could be transformative if they take it up. So those are my suggestions. I don't know if I've run short or long, but
I think you're just about on time there, Justin, just about. So my last question is for Joe, and the report obviously focuses heavily on funding, particularly the lack thereof. So Joe, you probably have the trickiest question of all three. So just to provide your views on the new and or emerging financing models, such as relationships between RPs and councils, and also pension funds.
Thanks, Rachel. Yes, I'm not sure whether it's by accident or design, but I think we appear to have left what is perhaps the million-dollar question for last, which is how on earth is all this going to be paid for? So Steve obviously touched on a number of solutions that were proposed by the Southwark report, all of which I think both individually and together can certainly have their part to play in that funding solution. So things like the reopening of the self-funding deal, but with a new rent agreement which better reflects the financial realities faced by councils, and which allows them to actually self-finance, as opposed to sort of take giving with one hand and taking away with the other. So creating that certainty that the government won't just simply arbitrarily and suddenly impose sort of rent caps. Extending the new burdens doctrine to HRAs, I think everybody accepts it. There was no logic why that never applied to HRAs, and as Steve mentioned, removing some of that red tape and inflexibility around existing funding streams. So things like the removal of the restriction around local authorities not being able to pool funding streams from different sources into the same development, and allowing greater flexibility on the use of right to buy receipts. But I think my view is if there's a realistic chance of meeting what are undoubtedly very ambitious housing targets, then there has to be an equally bold approach in looking at potential funding solutions. I think it's quite pertinent that obviously Justin was talking about collaboration in terms of delivery, because I think one of the interesting potential funding models which is being discussed is some kind of new PPF framework. So a kind of reworking of the original sort of PFI initiative, but the suggestion is that will be run through combined authorities, given their access to relevant procurement and project management skills. I think the challenge for a lot of local authorities, they don't necessarily have the in-house resources and expertise to run major housing projects. But the combined authority would then procure a special purpose vehicle backed by stakeholders, which could include the local authorities and housing associations, and then each new housing project funded would then be funded through a mix of debt and equity, bank investor loans. But the intention there being that those schemes will be structured so that to allow all relevant stakeholders, which obviously would include the local authorities, to hopefully profit from their investment by owning a stake in those housing projects, and those in turn would be managed by the housing association partner. So it's a sort of collaborative funding model, if you like, but it's also a means of harnessing the liquidity available from banks, pensions, pension schemes, insurance companies to invest in housing projects, but to boost housing at a very local level, whilst also obviously delivering that certainty and security that investors are looking to expect in returns. I think it's fair to say that there is that pension funds and insurance companies and other institutional investors are still attracted by the stability that social housing can bring, and that there is a critical role which institutional investors can bring to the that they can bring to the social housing piece. obviously some kind of PPF framework isn't without its challenges, not least to address some of the issues that arose over in the failings of the old sort of PFI, particularly around the length of those arrangements and the need for flexibility. But that sort of collaborative funding model is already some traction. We have things like the Sheffield Together Partnership. That's already a collaboration between the City Council, Homes England, the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority, and housing associations to boost housing delivery. So there are moves already towards that sort of collaborative funding model. I mentioned pension funds. I think something which is increasingly being talked about is the possibility of leveraging the public sector pension schemes to support housing projects and pooling those pension schemes. Obviously, that may well need to be incentivised by tax breaks, and there may well need to be some kind of government-backed guarantee to mitigate the risks around that. I think there's a long way to go around some of the detail around that, but I think given the scale of the problem we're facing, I can't see that not coming back onto the agenda, and I think in fact it would be right to do so because that is undoubtedly a huge sort of untapped potential. I think what is clear is that there's no quick fix, and I don't think there is one solution. I suspect in practice it will be a combination of what we regard as some of the more traditional funding models, but I think undoubtedly there does need to be sort of new and longer term funding models looked at as well. I think there is an understanding, and certainly this came out in the Southwark report, that there is nevertheless an urgent and immediate need for a capital injection from the council. I think to stabilise the HRA and to create the conditions for local authority to be prepared to start that investment programme. I think what was interesting is that the sort of figures that were being talked about in the Southwark report that were needed for that initial injection was actually really only to put councils back where they should have been if they hadn't lost monies through that rent cap. So I think that was quite an interesting sort of takeaway. Sorry, I've probably run over, but of course the big question for me as a property lawyer that's not been addressed in all of this is we can have, if we get that collaborative working going and we sort out funding, where are all these new properties all these new homes actually going to be built? But there's another question for an entirely another day.
Thank you, Jo. Thanks so much, Jo. You definitely got the trickiest topic, and you did really well taking us through that and giving us your thoughts. So I think Jo has alluded to the potential for future forums on further topics, and there's lots to still unpick about this. Obviously, we need to steel ourselves for the challenge, but there's also opportunities in there as ever. So an incredibly interesting and informative session. So I'd just like to say thank you to Steve, Justin, Jo and Helen. If you do have any questions for us, obviously feel free to drop us a line and we'll do our very best to give you our best possible responses, although noting that we clearly can't between us fully resolve the challenges of securing council housing, but nevertheless I think there's been some really good discussion here about, as I say, potential opportunities amongst all of it. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely festive season ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Best in